Welcome everyone to the X Numbers podcast. Scholarch McLarney, and with me is
Schoolman Fawcett. We are teachers at the world's only online Chesterton Academy, Chesterton Academy of St. Isidore Learning Center. This podcast is classical Catholic education in podcast form. And today I wanted to do something, and I wasn't sure how to title this or if it was even worth talking about in a way, but I'll just give some context for what inspired me to want to sit down and talk about what today's topic.
You want to talk about? Okay, all right.
I want to talk about this in this case. Okay, so I'm a Latin teacher. We've discussed that before, and I was trying to hone my Latin a little bit. And with languages, they always say conversation, right? That's how it's difficult to find an ancient Latin speaker.
Yes.
So instead of that, what I've been trying to do is read more Latin texts and actually try to translate them for myself to kind of hone my skill. And I thought, I've always been fond of Anselm. I love his Cur Deus Homo, and I love the ontological argument. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to see if I can, because the ontological argument, as he expresses it, which we'll talk about what that is in a minute, but it's kind of famously, it's kind of difficult prose, the way he explains it. So I thought, I'm going to try to translate this from Latin on my own and see how I do.
So you tried, that was your self, or the work you gave yourself was to translate some Anselm.
I figured we don't have enough to do at our job, and so I thought, this is professional development.
What a noble task.
Well, I hope it was fruitful, because actually, so I decided I would translate the first, I did it chronologically. He starts this in the book.
Well, okay, how about this? But before jumping in, though,
Sure.
a little bit of context for some of our listeners. Maybe they're not familiar who exactly
They
is
probably
Anselm.
aren't. They probably are not.
Who's
yeah.
Anselm?
So Anselm was the. We think of him as an English speaker, as Anselm of Canterbury.
Right.
Apparently, French speakers tend to prefer to call him Anselm of Bec, which is where he was from.
Okay.
And then Anselm of Lanfranc, I think, was where he was in Italy or something. Or I might be getting those confused, actually.
Okay.
I'll let the people at home look that up. But I think of him as Anselm of Canterbury.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's where he ended up. And
so he lived in Italy, he lived in France and England.
He concluded, I think, as an archbishop, to his great reluctance, like a lot of bishops. He was a abbot or a prior, and he preferred that work.
Okay.
He would have rather been doing theology and prayer than handling the administrative duties of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Right.
Right around the time of the Norman conquest, actually. It was shortly after that. So I think he actually played a role in kind of asserting Canterbury's role as the kind of the See of England.
Okay, right.
Again, that was not what he was primarily interested in. He's, I think, best remembered for writing those two works that I've mentioned before. A work on the atonement, on the incarnation, why God became man, putting forward the satisfaction theory of the atonement, which deserves its own episode. And he's famous for making an argument for God's existence that is still being discussed today. And that's what I wanted to hone in on.
The ontological argument.
It's known as the ontological argument.
Which is one of my favorites.
I agree. I like it. So we're not going to talk about it in detail today.
Okay.
We've discussed it off.
Should we mention what it is, though, or are we going to build up to it?
I think actually it's useful to know what it is before you get to it, because where I was going was I was just translating the first couple, the opening introduction and the first chapter. Okay. He lays out the ontological argument in chapters 2 through 4, and that's what you always see. Right. And people kind of skim over the first part. But reading through the introduction and chapter 1, knowing where he's going, made me realize I think there's something going on here that is very illuminating. Okay. But you sort of need to know where it's going to get there. So first, I'll just give an overview of the ontological argument with the recognition that in future episodes, perhaps we'll get into how exactly it works. Does it work? What are the responses to it? It's the history, because as I mentioned to you, some people say it's actually it's at the heart of every philosophy is how they engage with the ontological argument.
That might be pushing it a bit.
I thought it was at first. I'm less convinced of that now.
Okay, all right.
I'm thinking of maybe writing a book about this called The Most Important Argument.
The Most Important Argument.
Because
I'm going to read that.
We'll see. Well, this is the trial run for it, I guess. But Let's go with this. So how would you explain the ontological argument, which I know you talk about, because I remember I once heard your daughters run it past a student on a retreat. Sure. So I know they heard about it somewhere, and I assume it's from you. So
probably got it from Anselm himself. But so I guess there's a lot of arguments for God's existence. Like there's the argument from first cause, there's the argument from design, there's I like Lewis's argument from desire, which is more of a top-down. So the cosmological arguments are more looking at the data of the universe, empirical data which we have, and then making a case for why God must exist. The argument from desire, you could also have one from conscience. A slight variation is more from human experience as to why God must exist. The ontological argument, I think it's on its own a category of its own, per se. It's a term that Immanuel Kant actually labels this argument. And so basically, well, you have to help me through this, but essentially Anselm comes up with what is there's something which nothing greater can be conceived.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's, if we can have the premise that there's something which nothing greater can be conceived. All right.
Well, you can conceive of something. This is the thing. He says, you can conceive. If you think of God,
yes,
you're thinking of this idea, and the idea is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And if you can conceive that, this is important to lay the groundwork for the argument. Not that we're getting into this in detail, but it's that he's assuming you can conceive of God, and the reason you know that is because you're talking about God. So obviously you conceive of him. Well, what is God? Well, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived.
Okay, so if we can conceive of God, and God would be that which nothing greater can be conceived. So we can conceive of that, and God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. And, well, I guess the second step would be, is it better to... then God must. Is it better to exist or not exist? So,
or specifically, it says to exist in reality or to exist merely in the understanding.
Oh, right. Okay. So, is it better to exist in the understanding or in reality?
Yes.
Right, or merely in understanding, I suppose. So, what would you think? Is it better to exist in merely understanding? So, perhaps some intellectual noetic type of abstract concept, like we have this abstraction that we can make. Oh yeah, I can conceive of something abstractly. Or is it better to exist in reality? And the next is, it's better to exist in reality.
Yes.
Therefore, God must exist.
And the reason for that is, this is the key here, right? Is that so he says, by virtue of the fact you can conceive of God, he exists in your understanding, right? That's the point. And surely it's better to exist in reality as well as in the understanding than to just exist in the understanding. But here's the thing. If God only existed in your understanding but didn't exist in reality, then you could conceive of something better than God. Right? Anything that's real and that exists in reality would be better than the idea of God because it exists in reality.
Okay.
But you just conceived of something greater than which cannot be conceived. So if you can really conceive of that, but then you go on to say, well, I can conceive of something better, which is something that's real. Well, wait a minute. No, you can't. Because you just said you conceived of something greater than which cannot be conceived.
Yes.
So if you really have conceived of him, then he must exist.
Right.
because otherwise and then you could say, well, okay, he doesn't actually exist. Well, no, he does, because you've conceived of something greater than which cannot be conceived.
Right.
And the fact that you can conceive of it. So there's something, just by virtue of the fact that you've thought it, kind of proves that it exists, if you think about it enough.
So it's kind of a, I'll just call it a midway point, but between, say, arguments that are anthropological in nature, like our argument from conscience, the argument from desire, or the cosmological ones, which are more top down. This is kind of a meeting point, isn't it not? In the sense that it's starting with conception, but it's not simply leaving it in our minds. It's tending towards something which is greater, or it's in that sense, right? And then that's not an abstraction, or if there's nothing greater that we can conceive, then that by definition must exist in reality.
It's a curious. I mean, it's sort of an inverse of saying, just by thinking about it, you know that a square circle can't exist.
Right.
It's something you don't have to verify that empirically. It's just by virtue of reasoning through. You know that there will be nowhere in reality there will be a square circle.
Sure.
Right. This is like that in the other direction, and it's the only case where it works. Is to say, just by virtue of the fact you can think of the idea of God, you must know that he exists.
Yeah.
And the reason, we'll talk about this more later on some other episode. But the reason why it's such an important argument is that basically, it seems like if you reject it, you have to kind of go down the route of saying that our mind and reality aren't connected.
Right.
Which is what Kant actually goes into doing. But again, whether that's valid or not, that requires a whole other thing.
And I think part of the appeal of the argument is intuition, right?
I think
so there is something that resonates with the, I want to say, the deepest, what we can delve into within our own minds, right? So there's this certain light that goes off, realizing, there's something within my soul, within my mind, that resonates so strongly with this. It's almost as if it's acknowledging where we are in reality.
That is exactly what I think is actually going on. Because I think in going through the first section of the book is called the Proslogion, where he lays this out. Okay. In going through the first part and the first chapter, I think what a lot of people miss is Anselm is not saying, here, I'm going to suggest this thing you've never heard of before, and if you think about it, you'll realize I must be right. I think he's doing something different. Because what a lot of people find is they say, well, that sounds kind of convincing as an argument, or like they have trouble finding a logical flaw in it, but like, well, this isn't actually persuasive though. This just feels like it's a parlor game.
Right.
But I don't think what he's doing is he's setting out to do something like Aquinas, where he's going to say, you're not a believer in God, let me give you this argument that will change your mind.
Right.
I don't think that's what's going on
Okay.
here. And to do that, let's get into
let's
the
dive
text.
in.
Let's dive in.
Let's dive in.
The first section of this, as I've read this before, like, I first was exposed to the ontological argument in my undergraduate degree. This preliminary stuff just seemed like window dressing. I don't think it is. So here's the introduction to the Proslogion, which is the only thing I'm going to read in its entirety. Everything else I've curated excerpts from. But I'm actually going to read this in its entirety.
We're starting with the preface?
We're starting with the preface.
Okay.
Now, I have slightly adjusted... The thing in front of me is a little different than yours.
Sure.
I edited a couple of parts where I thought my translation was better. So
we're reading the
Schoolman
Fawcett
translation.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Let's hear it.
So he says, upon the insistent adjurations of certain brothers... So the great pleas, the prayers, he says, of his certain brothers. I wrote a work as an example of meditating upon the rational basis of faith, ratione fide, in the role of someone who, arguing silently with himself, investigates what he does not yet know. So he wrote a previous book prior to this, the Monologion, which is a bunch of arguments for God's existence, because the brothers asked him to write one.
Okay.
And he says, afterwards, considering that work to be composed of a chain of many arguments, I began to ask myself whether perhaps a single consideration could be found, which would require nothing other than itself for proving itself, and which would suffice by itself to demonstrate that God truly exists, and that he is the supreme good, needing no one else, yet needed by all else in order to exist, and to exist well. And whatever else we believe about the divine substance. So he's basically saying, I wrote this book before, which was a bunch of arguments for God's existence, but then I got to thinking, well, what if there was just one single argument that would prove God exists and everything that we believe about God? We wouldn't have to add a bunch of other stuff on. Everything that Christians believe about the divine substance, divine ontology, you could say. Right.
This is like a catch-all, a net that's cast wide enough, but in some ways narrow enough that it's only one argument, but it's capturing his entire previous work.
So I'll just start commenting now. To me, sounds almost like the definition of God's being, right? It's absolutely simple. Okay. It's just one thing, and yet you unpacking it mentally, it includes all the perfections of God.
Okay.
Right? I think that's interesting, and he does make that connection to whatever we believe about the divine substance, which is the Latin substantia. So I think he's trying to find an argument that's as simple as God is. So there's a pursuit of something deeper.
Okay. Yes.
Something deeper than just a bunch of arguments. And now look at how he talks about this. I often and eagerly turned my thinking towards this goal. Now, the Latin for turned, it's actually convertem, converterem, which of course literally convert means to turn. But exactly. Sure. But it's like I tried to convert to this. All right. And I often and eagerly turned my thinking to this goal. At times, what I was in quest of seemed to me almost apprehensible. At times, it completely escaped the edge of my mind. At last, despairing, I wanted to desist, as though from pursuit of a thing which was not possible to be found. But just when I wanted to completely exclude myself from this thinking, lest by occupying my mind in vain it would keep me from other projects in which I could make headway, just then it began more and more to force itself insistently upon me, unwilling and resisting as I was. Now, again, this is a little bit of a nuance in the Latin that it's really hard to capture this in English. But when he says, well, first of all, when he talks about the thinking, it's cogitare. It's the same word that's going to be used later when he talks about a thing greater than which cannot be conceived, cannot be thought. When he says, just then it began more and more to force itself upon me. The Latin is magis ac magis. It began to enforce it upon me with a kind of impunity, is what he says. Now that magis, it means great. It's like we're majesty, right? Like, so you could say it more and more greatly, or greater and greater impressed upon my thoughts.
Yeah, right.
It's almost like it's a thought greater than all the other thoughts.
Right.
So it's almost like he's anthropomorphizing this argument.
It does,
right? That he was pursuing it and it kept eluding him. And yet now when he finally kind of gives up on it and despairs of it, it turns and it becomes greater than his other thoughts. Right. When he's not trying to get it himself, it comes upon him. This thing that is like God. Right, this argument that's as elegant as God.
So it's not a him reaching out to the argument so much as the argument coming to him.
He can't. When he tries, he fails. Right. But when the argument is greater and greater, magis and magis, than everything else, then it conquers him in a way. Right. Then one day, when I was tired as a result of vigorously resisting its entreaties, what I had despaired of finding offered itself in the midst of the conflict of my thoughts in such a way that I eagerly embraced the thinking, which I, as one who was anxious, had been warding off. The word offered there, it's obtulit. Most of the times I found it in the Vulgate, it's talking about as like a sacrificial offering.
Oh, okay. So, like an oblation?
Yeah, well, I thought it was related to that. It's apparently not, but it sounds like it to me. But it finally, when I had despaired of it, it offered itself to me, is what he says, in the conflict of my thoughts, and I eagerly embraced it.
Okay.
Again, it sounds like he's talking about something more than just an argument. Like it's all intellectual and cognitive, but it feels more like it's someone's description of their relationship with God himself.
Well, yeah, that's the language of salvation, right? That's oblation or a sacrifice, and being offered, embracing the sacrifice. It offered
itself to me like it was a sacrifice. That's how it sounds. So then he gives some background, which again doesn't seem all that important. Supposing that he basically says, if I wrote this, I guess I'll read this. Supposing then that if what I rejoiced to have discovered were written down, it would please its readers. I wrote the following work on this subject, and various others, in the role of someone endeavoring to elevate his mind towards contemplating God, and in the role of someone seeking to understand what he believes. So notice, he's not saying, I wrote this to persuade the atheists that they were wrong. I wrote this in the role, in the persona, of somebody who's elevating his mind to contemplate God.
Right.
And who's seeking to understand what he already believes.
Right.
And then he goes on, and if you can skip...
That's his whole faith-seeking understanding.
That's what he was going to title it. That's the next section. I deemed this writing not worthy to be called a treatise, blah, blah, blah. So I gave a title to each. So the first one was called An Example of Meditating on the Rational Basis of Faith. The second was called Faith-Seeking Understanding. And remember, notice what he says at the beginning of this is he says, I wrote a book in the character of one reasoning with himself about what he doesn't know. But this one is him talking to God, which is what he goes on to say. So here's this is so easy to glide over, but I think there's some more to it. Okay. After several people had copied both works under their respective titles, I was urged by several to prefix my name to these writings, especially by Hugh, the most reverend Archbishop of Lyon, who was serving as apostolic delegate in Gaul, and who, on the basis of his apostolic authority, directed me to do this.
I can appreciate that, Hugh. That's like, I don't think that's a great idea, Hugh. He's like, okay, well, let me tell you.
The Archbishop invokes, exactly, he pulls rank to tell. And here's what I think that translation, it just says the Reverend Archbishop of Lyon. So the Latin there is et maxime reverendus archiepiscopus Hugh nomine.
Oh, okay, so he's great.
He's the most reverend. And that word it's maxime, which is going to come up again later. Yeah. Now, that is, in fairness, just how you addressed clerics back then, the most, like we were getting in English, the most reverend.
Yeah.
But it strikes me, it's echoing. Like, so he's the greatest reverend. Yeah. By virtue of his authority, being most reverend, urges me to do something, and then I have to kind of comply with it. It's almost like he's teasing out the implications of the ontological argument. Like, by virtue of accepting this, it puts you into the situation of being ecclesial, right, under the apostolic authority and under their authority, and you're compelled by it.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right, just as much as you would be by the argument itself.
So, to accept this, then the cogito, or thinking of this, and then this great argument. Then it brings us into communion under obedience
to the Trinitarian God, the God revealed in Jesus Christ. He's not interested in just because remember his point is that this is he's not interested in like a God who just exists. You know what I mean? Nothing to do but exist, like C.S. Lewis would say. This is like the God who's revealed himself, right? Yes. And by being most great, it intrudes on my thoughts, right? And it puts me in the situation of being in the church, right? That's the point of what this argument is supposed to be. So this might just be like a historical detail, like, the reason it's got this title is because the bishop told me to do it. But I think there might be something more going on here. There's like a literary purpose for that. So then he says, I named the former one monologion, which is a soliloquy, and the present one is called proslogion, or an address. Mm-hmm. So there's that context. Now I'm just going to slide over what's going on in chapter 1, but it's worth how it starts off. Come now, insignificant man. I think you have that. Yeah, that there, yeah. Come now, insignificant man, leave behind for a time your preoccupations, seclude yourself for a while from your disquieting thoughts. Turn from your heavy cares and set aside your wearisome tasks. Make time for God and rest a while in him. Enter the antechamber of your mind. Shut out everything except God and what is of aid to you in seeking him. After closing the chamber door, seek him out. Speak now, my whole heart, speak to God. I seek your countenance, O Lord, though I seek. Now, first of all, I'm not positive about this.
Mm-hmm.
I have a theory that first section, the come now, insignificant man. So the Latin for insignificant man, it's homuncio. It means like a little man. That's actually what it means. It's little man. It's like it's diminutive of man.
Right.
I think this might be God talking to him at first. Like, you know how in the Psalms, it'll like of course you know this, right? We've discussed this before. The narrative voice kind of switches. They're like dialogues.
Yeah.
That's kind of how this feels to me. It begins with God inviting Anselm to come in, leave things aside. Because Anselm is the little man, right? Compared to God. And then the rest of the book is actually Anselm's response to this invitation by God. I'm not sure about that.
So the voice is switching then.
I think
that speak now my whole heart.
I think that's now Anselm now turning and speaking to himself.
Yes.
I might be wrong about that, but it just strikes me because, as we'll see, there's a whole lot of psalm resonances. So I'm skipping ahead here because like I said, I curated these. But well, actually no, this section that is there at the beginning. He says, "So come now, Lord my God, teach my heart where and how to seek you, where and how to find you. If you are not here, O Lord, where shall I seek you who are absent? But if you are everywhere, why do I not behold you as present? But surely you dwell in light inaccessible. Yet where is light inaccessible? Or how shall I approach unto light inaccessible? Or who will lead me to and into this light, so that in it I may behold you?" And then it goes on, he says later on, "Oh, that unhappy fate of man when he lost that end for which he was made. Oh, that hard and ominous fall. Alas, he lost, and what he found, what vanished, and what remained. He lost the happiness for which he was made, and found an unhappiness for which he was not made." Then he goes on and talks about his own quest for God.
Yeah, that seems to be a new section there. I know there's a paragraph division.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But if you look at his way he's using pronouns, that opening section when it seems that God is speaking to him, he's speaking of God in the third person, like he, Lord, and so on. And then when he says "speak my heart," this is, I mean, the subject is changing there, but so now then he speaks, but then he starts to use the "you." Right? And so he's speaking personally, which we see that's coming through in the Psalms. But in this section, which you just mentioned there about, the unhappy fate of man when he lost, and so on, it continues on. Now he's back to the voice is switching, it seems.
Oh, true.
Right? So he's addressing humanity in general, whereas the opening bit could be God speaking to him, or, it could be Anselm speaking to a neophyte or something like this, who now has to enter into his chamber, but it doesn't matter because either way will work, right? And it's the same function.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah, well, I think that shows its devotional purpose for sure. So then, after talking about the fall, he talks about himself. He says, "To what was I aspiring? For what do I sigh? I sought after good things, and behold, here is turmoil. I was striving unto God, but collided with myself. I wanted to laugh, I hoped for gladness, but as a result my sighs increase," right? "How long, O Lord? How long, O Lord, will you forget us? How long will you turn your face away from us? When will you look upon us and hear us? When will you enlighten our eyes and show us your face? When will you restore yourself to us? Look upon us, O Lord, enlighten us, reveal yourself to us." I had to cut a lot because, as you can tell, he goes on in this vein for quite a bit. You may be trying to find it. But he does say, enlighten. When will you enlighten our eyes and show us your face? Now, I'm just going to mention quickly. That's a quote from Psalm 13, right?
Okay.
Where it says, "How long will you hide your face from us? Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my foes will rejoice." The next Psalm, Psalm 14, opens with, "The fool has said in his heart there is no God."
Okay.
So I think there's an intentional thing here because the next chapter is going to be a commentary on that passage. Right. And in the same way that Psalm 13 says, "God help me, show yourself to me. When will I see you?" And the next psalm is, "The fool doesn't believe in God."
Right.
I think there's something going on here.
Okay.
Chapter 1 is, "I'm striving for God." And the next chapter is, "Here's why you're wrong for not believing in God."
Yes.
And then I think this is the last paragraph. He says, "Permit me at least from afar or in the deep to look towards your light. Teach me to seek you, reveal yourself to me as I seek. For unless you teach me, I cannot seek you. And unless you reveal yourself, I cannot find you." This is key. So the context of this book is not, here's how to persuade an atheist. Because he's being really clear. That's not going to happen unless God initiates, right? Let me desire you in seeking you. Let me find you in loving you. Let me love you in finding you. O Lord, I acknowledge and give thanks. You created me in your image so that I may remember, contemplate, and love you. But this image has been so effaced by the abrasion of transgressions, so hidden from sight by the dark billows of sins, that unless you renew and refashion it, it cannot do what it was created to do. O Lord, I do not attempt to gain access to your loftiness, because I do not consider my intellect equal to this task. Our intellects are not equal to this. Right. But I yearn to understand some measure of your truth, which my heart believes and loves. For I do not seek to understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. But I believe even this. Unless I believe, I shall not understand.
Right.
Now, we've discussed before the quote from Isaiah. Again, I think that's for another time. But I'll just mention, so he says, you mentioned before, it resonates with us when we hear this argument.
Oh, it's the deepest core of our being.
Well, and I think this is what he's saying here. He's saying we all have the image of God implanted in us already. Yes. That's the phrase. So that I can remember, contemplate, and love you. But this image has been effaced by sin. So I can't get to you, even though I know you're there, without your love initiating. Then after that comes the ontological argument, which we've already discussed, so we're not going to. But I will just say this. The end of chapter 4, when he explains, after he's explained the whole argument, he's laid it all out, he says, where's the exact phrase at the end of chapter 4? Is, thanks to you, good Lord, thanks to you, because what at first I believed through your giving, now by your enlightening I understand to such an extent that you, even if I did not want to believe you exist, I could not fail to understand that you exist. And there's that phrase there. Thanks to you, good Lord, thanks to you, because what at first I believed through your giving, now by your enlightening I understand. And that was what he prayed for in chapter 1. Yes. Enlighten my eyes, when will you enlighten me? So I think, just to conclude, that the point of the ontological argument in this is not, it's going to persuade you if you don't believe. It's God has cleared up the dust and the sin that's gotten in the way of that image you already have there. You know he's there, you long for him, but you can't get there by yourself.
Yes.
Ask him, and he will enlighten you, and he'll show you that he's true, and that's what's going on in this ontological argument. Which doesn't mean it's not a valid argument.
Yeah.
It leaves the unbeliever without excuse, because you can show it's valid, and that proves God exists.
Sure.
But he's not saying it's going to convince you. He's saying that's God's graciousness to you, that you recognize its truth. That's what I noticed, I think, going through this.
Yes, and that you understand it, in that right. So in the sense of standing under. Right, so that you realize all of reality that I'm under is God, right?
Yes.
So this is it's like we in Him we live and move and have our being, right? As Paul points out. So this is realizing. So the understanding is part of this standing under.
Which that's what he goes on to unpack, to say if he is the greater than which cannot be conceived, he must be the creator, he must be loving, he must forgive our sins, or at least he must be free to forgive our sins and capable of it. Everything that Christians believe, he then deduces from this definition. That's what the rest of the book is about.
Right, yeah.
So that's, again, the point, is like this proves the God I believe in to be real.
Yeah, and it's not just like I understand how, this mug makes a noise when I drop it, or I figure out things as an infant to a toddler to an adolescent, but how this world works. So there's that type of understanding why this argument resonates with how we make sense of this world around us, but then also our minds and reality. But coming further than that, it's understanding beneath like Archbishop Hugh, right? So bringing me under this as well. So it's a complete standing of having stasis in God and rest.
I think that's exactly it. And that's what you have to have in mind before you get into the argument proper, which we'll do another day, I think.
Okay, so let us conclude with a prayer.
Absolutely.
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
St. Anselm,
pray for us.
In the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit.